Thanks, Whit. My name is Chris Macaluso. I've met, I think, most of you in the room at some point. I'm the Director of Marine Fisheries for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and thanks for being here again today to, day two of this discussion. I thought yesterday's discussion went very well. Today's may be a little bit more lively. There's a lot of passionate opinions about this subject matter. Especially right now in my neck of the woods back in Louisiana, where this is a particularly raw subject, for folks who are recreational fishermen and concerned about our ecosystems back home. It's a topic that TRCP and our sport fishing partners, especially CCA Louisiana, especially the Louisiana Charter Boat Association, and even organizations that we don't always work with on our issues, but who very much care about the impact of the Menhaden fishery and the pogie fishery in Louisiana, have come on board. Folks like Audubon, Audubon, Louisiana, several of what we would consider more environmental groups, have joined us in this effort. So with that, our discussion today is going to focus on managing the Gulf of Mexico Menhaden, and especially in regards to conservation efforts and how that fishery impacts sport fishing business and access in the Gulf. Joining us for our discussion today are our panelists, Dr. Aaron Adams. He's the Director of Science and Conservation at the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. Richard Fisher, who is the Executive Director of the Louisiana Charter Boat Association. Jesse Simpkins, who is the Vice President of Marketing at St. Croix Rods, and an avid recreational angler, somebody who's been down in Louisiana and seen these, this fishery firsthand. And then Mike Wayne, who is the Atlantic Fisheries Policy Director for the American Sport Fishing Association, who will hopefully give us some insight, or certainly give us some insight, on how Menhaden management has advanced in the Atlantic and what that could mean for the future of Menhaden management in the Gulf. So just to kind of tee up the subject a little bit, we call them pogies in the Gulf of Mexico. We don't call them Menhaden. I'm not sure a lot of people would know what a Menhaden is if you talk to them about it, but we call them pogies, and they're absolutely an essential forage base for popular sport fishing game fish like speckled trout, redfish, tarpon, jacks, mackerels, and pretty much anything that swims out there. Anything that's going to eat smaller fish is going to prey at some point in its life on a pogie. Each year there are two foreign-owned companies that harvest around 1.2 billion pounds of pogies in the Gulf of Mexico. They reduce these things into anything from livestock feed to cosmetics to perfume to industrial lubricants, to fish meal. They're a valuable commodity, and a lot of those products get shipped overseas. About 80 to 90% of that harvest is in Louisiana waters. So that's where a lot of the focus of our early campaign has been, because that's the nexus of the problem. That can include as much as 60 million pounds or more of bycatch, which can be anything from sharks to redfish, mackerels, but also other essential forage fish like croaker, mullet, herring, shrimp, blue crabs. Pretty much anything they can put the net around is going to get caught and killed in that net. And some recent studies have indicated, some preliminary information coming out of those studies indicate that pogie harvest could be reducing speckled trout, redfish populations significantly, by as much as 50% reduction in biomass of those two species because of Menhaden harvest in the Gulf. They're also having a significant impact on tunas, on tarpon, mackerels, jacks, and several other species, including some marine mammals. Pogies are harvested with very little oversight in the Gulf. In the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission sets catch limits. In the Gulf, there really are no catch limits. In fact, the only catch limit that's set is one that the industry themselves agrees that is going to be the tipping point. So if they harvest, say, 500 million pounds or something like that, more than what they're harvesting right now, they think that's going to make the stock collapse. But there is no management in regards to the role that these fish play in the ecosystem, the role that they play in water quality, and other essential roles that they play, out in the Gulf. The TRCP, ASA, CCA Louisiana, CCA National, and various other organizations that I've mentioned, Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, Angler Action Network, Pew, we've all joined in a coalition to write down on paper and share with lawmakers and policymakers what we want out of management of this fishery. In terms of moving towards ecosystem management, getting them out of some sensitive habitat areas, similar to what they've done in every other Gulf state but Louisiana. And how we move forward in recognizing the importance of this fishery and the damage that this industrial reduction fishery is doing to our habitat. So with that, I'm going to play a short video. And I feel like, ordinarily I would apologize for the quality of this video, but I don't, because this is as authentic as it gets. This is not manipulated in any way. This is not taken out of context. This is what anglers in Louisiana see during the summertime and the early fall when these boats are on the water doing what they do.
Less than 300 yards off the beach. That's ridiculous.
So this is later that afternoon.
The nets catch everything. I know they allow so much bycatch, but they shouldn't be that close to the beach. That's the upper island right there.
Alright, so this is the reality of what's going on here. You see this? I'm gonna bring in the boat. That's a big, beautiful Louisiana redfish. Dead as doornail. Because of those guys over there. Because of that. Do we have an amazing fishery in Louisiana? Yes, we do. But if this keeps happening, Sportsman's Paradise is gone. This is the only one here. There's, as far as you can see, white bellies. All dead fruit stock that those wonderful people are killing on a daily basis.
So something interesting about so both of those guys who shot those videos were charter boat captains. One of them, the last guy you hear is a guy named Eric Newman, and he fishes out of Empire, and that's where one of the processing plants are. So those guys see this stuff all the time. The other one was near Grand Isle, which is one of the most popular recreational fishing spots along the Gulf. And at the time when that video was shot, there was supposedly a gentleman's agreement in place where the pokey boat processors said they would not fish within a mile of that beach. And you guys saw very clearly that that boat was a lot closer than a mile from that beach. And so that's the reason why during the course of this past legislative session, and that's why we had to start highly engaging with our lawmakers and policymakers in Louisiana to say, guys, these gentlemen's agreements don't work. They violate them all the time. Those guys are constantly in that shallow water, beating the hell out of those beaches and killing those fish, and handshake agreements aren't going to cut it. We need some hard legislation and some hard enforcement to make sure that we can prevent this stuff from happening. So I want to turn it over to our panel and give folks an opportunity to make some opening remarks from their perspective. I want to hear from Aaron first. Because one of the largest resident populations of tarpon is in the Mississippi River Delta area, and that's where the concentration of this harvest takes place. And so from a science perspective, I'd like to hear his opinion about what kind of impact this concentrated harvest is having on the fish that their organization focuses on, but just in general, removal of that much biomass from that area, what kind of impact that could have on water quality and other fish populations.
How much time do we have, Chris? Where to start? So I think one of the things to remember with a lot of these management issues, stock assessments and whatnot, is that we have to put this where we are now in the context of history. The data we have now are obviously now, if we go back 50 years, 60 years, it's a very different ecosystem. There were more of everything, but there were also a hell of a lot more menhaden than there are now. So when we think about how the interaction between menhaden and things like tarpon, redfish, trout, etc., and the extent that those species depend upon menhaden for food, and some of the recent statements about how, menhaden aren't that important, those fish just switch to other things to eat. Back in a less pressured ecosystem, that wasn't the case. So anybody who fishes knows that at certain times of year, your favorite fish is going to target on a particular prey species. And in fish like menhaden, that's especially important because their peak season of higher density is associated in many ways with them getting ready to spawn in the fall through winter. And so it's what we call, in the science world, we call that provisioning. So using tarpon as an example, they spend much of the spring, say from May through the summer, doing a lot of spawning. And spawning takes a lot of energy, especially for the females. Anybody who fishes for tarpon, say in Southwest Florida, when the fish first show up, they often are kind of husky, especially the females. After spawning, much thinner. And the thought is that after spawning, that's when they start their seasonal migrations. So we've tracked fish, for example, from the Florida Keys going up to the Louisiana Delta, the mouth of the Mississippi, as well as the Chesapeake Bay. And what do those two places have in common? Massive menhaden populations. And so the thought is, and this has been shown for many species, that they provision. They put the feed bag on and try and put on a lot of weight and store a lot of fat because they got to get through winter, right, where there might not be as much, but they also during that time have to get ready for the next spawning season so that they have eggs and sperm they need by the next spring. So if you reduce the amount of menhaden, which are super high calorie content, available to those fish at that really important time, they might switch to other species like shrimp or crabs or something like that, but it's not the same intake. Right? It'd be like going to an Olympian, right? Great time of year to think of that, and changing their diet to what they have now to have them go into Burger King. Sure, they get food, but they're not going to compete well because they're not getting the types of nutrients that they need. So I think it's important for us, and we'll hear more about the ecosystem-based modeling and stuff that they're doing with some of this, I'm sure. That is now. It doesn't take into account the way it used to be and the way it's supposed to be. So to a certain extent, I think that our game fish, whether it's tarpon or redfish or trout or striped bass on the East Coast, they're already working at a deficit because there's fewer menhaden than there were, and there's also fewer of every other prey species that they're working on, or they're trying to feed on. So for example, getting out of Gulf of Mexico for a second, then I'll wrap it up. In the Northeast, blueback herring used to be really big, I mean, huge populations, they're essentially gone. From an ecological perspective, I mean, you don't even include them. Those used to be a huge part of the forage base for striped bass. Now striped bass don't have them, so it's menhaden, and striped bass eat a lot of sand eels, which I'm sure they always did, but not to the extent that they used to. Right, so I think we have to keep those kind of things in consideration. We're already kind of at a deficit. So when we talk about some of these negotiations about harvest, sustainable yield and everything, there's a very big part of the pie that's already missing. And I think we have to think about restoring that, as well as getting the menhaden harvest into a more responsible position that they should.
Well, and I can say that you know, having fished for redfish for a very, very long time in Louisiana, and spending a lot of time on those beaches and in the passes during the summertime, there is absolutely 100% guarantee that the reason those redfish are dying in those nets is because during the late summer and early fall is when they're spawning. They're in large spawning aggregates. Those fish that you see are all spawning size redfish, and they're all in there eating those pokies. They're either eating crabs that are on the beaches spawning, they're eating pokies. And it's just common sense. You know, everybody knows it. And yet getting the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries to admit that was an extraordinarily painful process and something they still don't want to admit. So, Richard, I'm going to turn to you because the two of the guys we saw shooting those videos with charter captains, and your charter guys see this every day, and I know that there has been a real push from your members to do something about this.
There has. Thank you, Chris. Representing the Louisiana Charter Boat Association, I know many of you see those videos. Maybe you're new to this issue. Maybe you're a little bit surprised by those, but unfortunately, I've been seeing them for years. I've been hearing about them, these stories for years. This is becoming a huge, huge issue, and it's a multi-pronged issue. It's a user conflict issue because these boats are running not only charter fishermen, but also private recreational fishermen out of these spots. It's a bycatch issue, as we just saw the proof of the pudding in those videos, and that's unfortunately just a very, very, very small sample size of what our guys are seeing out there. And as you touched on very well, Aaron, it's also an ecological issue, because if we're taking the food away from our favorite species that we like to catch, it's only common sense that eventually we're going to have to pay the piper. That you can only do that for so long. You know, you use the Burger King analogy. I was going to use, like, say you go to your favorite supermarket that you always buy you and your family's food at, and suddenly all the shelves are empty. Well, that's going to adversely affect you and your family and your community, isn't it? So we just want there to be more oversight, there to be more studies, more studies, better funded studies. Bring it in with the other commercial and recreational fisheries, and we'll analyze the data in an objective way, and we'll see. We'll let smart people decide what should be done about this issue. But I think just from the fact that the issue's in the shadow, that this industry is in the shadows so much, that there is so little regulation and oversight, and just frankly scientific knowledge about the intended and unintended consequences of this industry, we need to learn more. And our captains in Louisiana, as well as the recreational fishermen, are fired up and upset about this issue, and we're gonna keep fighting for it at our state legislature. You know, you mentioned, Chris, all the different entities that we had coming to the table at the state legislature. We had the charter industry, the recreational fishing industry. We had some other commercial fishing industries. We had boat dealerships, manufacturers, bait retailers come to the table. We had environmental groups. We even had a gentleman for an oil and gas company who's affiliated with recreational anglers in Louisiana. So you had oil and gas, and you had the environmental entities. I've never seen a larger coalition go to the state capitol and then not get all that we were asking for. So maybe that says something about Louisiana politics, but we are where we are, and we'll keep pushing. You can be sure of that.
Well, and Richard, you know, it is worth noting that these processes are long-term. getting legislation through, especially in an industry that's so ingrained in Louisiana politics, that is, in a little history with the Menhaden industry. They don't hire people to be their representatives, and they don't hire people to speak to politicians who don't know how to do it very well. And they're very good at writing checks, and that goes a long way. And we know that some of the state legislators who are particularly problematic have very close associations with the industry, and really don't know a whole lot about how these guys do what they do. They don't know a lot about the harvesting process. They don't know a lot about the processing. They don't know a lot about the economic impact. They just know that they've gotten a lot of support from that industry. And so we've got a little bit of an uphill climb, but it's encouraging to know that, the bill that was introduced to get the boats off the beach, to get them at least into a little bit deeper water, 12 to 13 feet of water, passed the Louisiana House. It would have passed the Louisiana Senate in whatever form it was presented, even though it got gutted in committee, and it was really only a couple of lawmakers that held this up. And so we know we have support. We just have to clear those last couple of hurdles, and I think we can get there over the next couple of years. Jesse, I want to, from the perspective of somebody who comes down to Louisiana as a recreational fisherman, who brings customers and clients of St. Croix, who loves the resource. You've been down there several times. I know you've wanted to be as engaged as possible in this effort. Share a little bit of your perspective, what you've seen on the water, and why you personally want to see this through.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I'm not a scientist. I am not somebody who has business per se, right, working with the charter captains. I'm not a policy person. I'm an angler, right? I love to go fishing. I love the Gulf of Mexico, right? So much so that I've taken my family there so many times. It's the last place I went to take my father fishing before he passed. It's a special place, right? I've been there for 25 years. I've taken multiple trips a year. I've fished from Grand Isle, Lafitte, Buras, obviously Venice. I've spent an inordinate amount of my fishing time in that particular area. I have friends there that are businessmen, and I've seen it change, and not for the better. These particular videos that you see, I lived those, right? That's not just something that one person shot, right? I personally have been in a boat that has been cut off by a pogey boat that is putting a net out right next to the shore. I've been there, right? And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm just trying to be a little, passionate about this. I've taken numerous customers, partners, friends down there. I think, Jeff, you were you went down with me for the first time that you went to Venice, right? I sat before I came here and I thought about how many people I personally have brought to that particular area. It was well over 300, right? It's where I choose to spend my time, my money, and my passion with other people. And yet I'm seeing this change that isn't good. I've got friends who go out and cast net for pogey, right? They have for years. And they talk about the fact that they used to get pogies in those waters that were this big. Now they're catching pogies in the waters that are this big. And the speculation is, I'm not a scientist, the speculation is these boats continue to take the adult menhaden, especially during that time frame, and there are no longer that many adult menhaden in the fishery at that time. Again, I can only talk about what I'm being told from that standpoint. I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars personally and professionally to fish in that area, right? I want to support this. Right? I want to support the people that are down there. The amount of charter captains, the amount of bait that's sold there, the amount of slips that are sold, all this economic data that we have, right? And when we look at it, when we compare it to what there is for the producers, right, the processors, I'm amazed that this has not gone farther, because quite frankly, when I look at it, and I just want to take it from a business perspective, the millions, if not billions of dollars that we get on the recreational side versus the millions or 100 million that they get for processing, it doesn't make sense. Just from a business standpoint. And so I want to make sure that I can, 10 years from now, hopefully I'm retired, right? I want to spend an inordinate amount of time there during the year enjoying that fishery. And if we don't do something collectively about it soon, right, I might not have that opportunity. So I want to be very selfish, right? I want to give my time, my voice, and my efforts to help make sure that we do something here, because quite frankly, I want to be fishing.
Well said, and all 100% accurate, because it's a galling experience. And I've seen the boats operate before, but last summer I had an experience that was unique. I happened to be out at one of the barrier islands in Terrebonne Parish shooting a television show, talking about $200 million effort to restore this barrier island using oil spill penalties, and one of these boats pulled up less than 100 yards from us and made a set while we were fishing, in water that was less than 6 feet deep. And when we shot the video and documented that and explained what these guys were doing, it showed that to some policymakers in Louisiana. They called me a liar. They said, you manipulated that video, you took it out of context, and I had to stop them and say, guys, there is no context to this. None of these videos are taken out of context. The entire context of this is we're on the beach fishing, we have a camera in our hand, this is what happened. That's the only context there is. So, part of the reason why we talk a little bit about the science, if you see in one of these videos, you'll see the size of the Menhaden that are floating, that were released by the net from that boat, mixed in with the bull redfish. Those are less than a year-old fish. Those are what they call in the science business, I've learned, age 0 fish. That's fish that haven't had an opportunity to spawn. Those are the fish that live in that surf zone. Generally, you're not seeing the larger fish that are farther offshore in that surf zone. You're seeing the 3 to 5 inch fish that the speckled trout and the redfish are in there to eat. And so that's why for us, a primary focus early in this campaign is to get them off of the beach, get them out of that sensitive habitat, get them out of those areas where they're damaging the beaches physically, but also get them out of the areas where we know that the chances of bycatch of redfish and speckled trout and other species are going to be higher, because that's what the size menhaden that are living in that surf zone are what those fish are in there to eat. And if you target those small menhaden, you're going to kill more speckled trout and redfish. It's just the facts. So, Mike, one of the steps in this process is moving towards ecological management. There is no ecosystem management model for the Gulf of Mexico, but there is one in the Atlantic that I think can be a bit of a roadmap of how we get improvements in management and consideration for the ecosystem in the Gulf. What do you think? And I realize this is as big a topic as I asked Aaron to address, maybe even bigger because of all the policy implications. But what are some of the first steps that need to be taken in the Gulf to get into the place that you guys are in the Atlantic?
Yeah, thanks. So it's a long story for Atlantic Menhaden. It took over a decade to get ecosystem reference points in place for that fishery. But I do want to say that, hearing these stories, looking at the videos, the grassroots efforts were really what brought that change in the Atlantic. And the coalition working together, like you said, bringing partners together that you might not typically work with, but everybody shares this common interest to protect the forage base for the whole ecosystem. And it was building that broad coalition and working with the fishery managers to say, this is an objective and a goal. We need to make sure we're accounting for the role of menhaden in the ecosystem with the way we manage these stocks. And like I said, for Atlantic, it took 10 plus years, and a lot of that time was spent on, okay, how do we better understand the ecosystem from a scientific standpoint to actually set a catch limit that is responsible to that ecosystem? And so the scientists came together, they worked through all the different data sets that are out there, looking at, you know, the predator stomach contents, what's the component of menhaden in all these predator stomachs, using that in a modeling framework to help decide, okay, these are the catch limits that need to be in place to ensure that there's enough menhaden out there to feed all these predators. So I think, Chris, to your question about like what's the first step? To me, it's really establishing clear goals and objectives, making sure those managers understand how important it is to be accounting for menhaden's role in the ecosystem, and getting that groundswell grassroots effort going so that they understand at every turn we're working towards a better management system that accounts for menhaden's role in the ecosystem. And I think I'll talk a little bit about the challenges, if that's all right. On the Atlantic side, we have a management framework where all the states work together under a compact to make a fisheries management decision together. And so that compact is from Maine to Florida. All the states sit on the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and all of their constituencies within all their states can work with their commissioners and let them know how important this issue is. And so that's why I highlighted the grassroots efforts as being such a critical component there. And on the Atlantic side, you've got that commission in place, and you've got the authority under the Atlantic Coastal Act for those states to make a joint decision, a joint management decision, and then the requirement that all the states go back and implement whatever that decision was. So for Atlantic menhaden, it's making sure each state adheres to their state-specific quota. On the Gulf, unfortunately, the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission doesn't have that same regulatory authority, and so it's really reliant on each individual state, as Chris mentioned. And so that's where I feel like trying to focus on where is a bulk of the harvest coming from, and really trying to push the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission to do everything they can to set a harvest limit that would apply across the Gulf, even though they don't have the management authority to do that. And I think establishing sort of a clear goal and objective to get to that endpoint, using the Atlantic model as a roadmap, would be a really good approach. And so trying to work with your state legislatures to get them to understand that model already exists. Can we work through that same model in the Gulf to ultimately arrive at an endpoint that allows us to manage this resource in an ecosystem context where we can account for the role of menhaden as forage for all these recreationally important species. And I just want to reiterate, it was a long, bumpy road to get there, but once sort of the momentum started to build, we were able to see sort of where we were headed and what we wanted to achieve, and push it in that direction to a really strong grassroots efforts approach. So that would kind of be my suggestion for trying to use that Atlantic model in the Gulf.
Well, we're certainly going to have to rely on it, because it's the one that's out there. It's the one that's kind of set the benchmark, and I think seeing some of the pitfalls, the potholes, and some of the struggles that folks went through in the Atlantic in an effort that took well over a decade to get put in place is going to hopefully expedite the process a little bit in the Gulf. I think it's worth noting that Richard and I and several other sport fishing representatives and charter boat captains sat in endless meetings with the bogey industry and with the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and even some legislators throughout the course of last year and early this year. And the Menhaden processors, the Pogge processors, have received a sustainability certification from the Marine Stewardship Council. And they really like that certification, and they like to wave it around as much as possible, to show that they're not having a huge impact on this ecosystem. But in order to keep that certification, they have to be supportive of moving towards ecological management. I think it's incumbent upon us as conservationists, as conservation organizations, and the sport fishing industry to stay on top of that process as much as possible. Because if the Menhaden industry drives that process of creating that ecological management, they're going to do just enough to keep their certification. We want to make sure that this is a robust, thorough, scientifically driven process that does take fully into account the role of that fish in the ecosystem. Aaron, I got another question for you, if you don't mind. One of the problems we're facing here in trying to figure out the impact of this industrial reduction fishery in the Gulf is the gaps in the science. It is the fact that there's a lack of observer coverage, and the fact that a lot of the data that's being used in defense of the industry is as much as 50 or 60 years old. Where do you see as the most prominent gaps in that science? What can we do in the short term to address those gaps?
Keep asking me questions I could talk about for 2 hours.
I understand. It may be the most complex thing that we've dealt with in my time at TRCP.
Well, I think we need to start at a fundamental level. In many fisheries, we don't have sufficient data, even on, for stock assessments for spotted gaps. So that's a big problem. To let you know how basic some of the gaps are, we don't even have a map of the bottom habitats in the Gulf of Mexico. So how are we going to know what the unfished populations of fish that depend on, say, a reef should be if we don't know how much habitat there is? If you're in the terrestrial world and you're managing, you name it, elk, the first thing on your list is how much suitable habitat is there for that elk. And then you look at your age structure, and their availability of different forage, and you figure out how many can be hunted sustainably. Unfortunately, in the marine fisheries world, we are relying on a system of stock assessment focus that's 150 years old. And that system, that framework, that paradigm, is not set up to incorporate ecosystem values. So whether it's how much prey is eaten, whether it's habitat reliability, the influence of weather on different species, your rainy season versus not, we're lacking most of that data for most of the fisheries that we manage. So this is probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but the great thing about the ecological reference points for the Atlantic Menhaden is that's a really good step to start to incorporate those types of things. And I say it's a step. It's nowhere near where we need to be. Because if you look at, for example, one of the recent models looking at Menhaden on the Atlantic coast and the importance of prey, they only had enough data to use striped bass in that model. There are dozens of game fish species that depend on those Menhaden for that provisioning period. And that's not just the Chesapeake Bay. Those Menhaden, that population is up and down the East Coast. And with climate change, it's expanding northward. And we're not prepared for that. So, again, this isn't the answer you wanted, but what we're really pushing for here in your decadal time frame is a paradigm shift to how we manage these fisheries. Because even in the Atlantic, where they've looked at the diet composition of fish and how many Menhaden, so much of it has specific place and time. And those you guys who fish a lot, charter captains for sure, know exactly the places and exactly the times to maximize your catch because what they're eating and what not. Scientifically, we are not there. And part of the reason we're not there is because we are not prioritizing the biological information that I've been talking about in these management regimes. We're starting from a different place and trying to figure out whether that information fits into our models, rather than trying to, in parallel, while we still have to use those models, in parallel, we need to be developing other models that give us better information. So instead of saying we have ecological reference points for Menhaden that we're developing for the Gulf, we should say our stock assessment and ability to harvest is based on these dozen factors for which we have sufficient data. And it's about prioritization of where we've got limited resources. And so for Menhaden, the habitat thing is huge, for sure. The fact that they're focusing on young of year and even young adults in those nearshore waters is extremely problematic, because that will lead to overfishing, and probably already has. And even within the adults, young adults, if I can remember the numbers for Atlantic Menhaden, the young adult female might have 30,000 eggs. Atlantic Menhaden can whip them up 10, 12 years if they're not fished. An 8-year-old Menhaden will have 300,000 eggs, right? So your productivity is different. And what happens in most species is that those young females, even though they have fewer eggs, are also not as good at reproducing, and so their output is not as good. Those of you guys who hunt for deer know about older and younger females. It's the same with birds, right? So I keep bringing back examples from the terrestrial world because they've been doing this for 100 years in a different way. And so what I'm pushing for here is we have to continue to think in these other ways, but we have to keep pushing a lot harder. And I also think that TRCP is a great avenue for this. We have to start accessing our colleagues in the terrestrial world to learn how they have been managing, because we keep trying to put this square peg in the round hole of stock assessment, and we keep having these conversations, arguing about maximum sustainable yield, which in itself doesn't give us the margin of error if we have a really dry rainy season and those juvenile Menhaden don't survive. Our MSY is based on data from 2 years ago. We're not accounting for that realistic stuff that you guys see every year. All right, so again, probably not the answer you're looking for, but I think we need a fundamental change, and this is a good first step.
Well, I agree, it's a good first step, and I think we were all looking forward to seeing a final product of a study that was conducted by the University of Florida and NOAA using some oil spill penalty monies that was looking at the impact, potentially if ecological management, ecological reference points were put in place in the Gulf, what that would look like under current scenarios of Menhaden harvest. And a lot of the focus is on speckled trout and redfish because it's such an economic driver, it's such a cultural driver in that part of the Gulf. But you're right, it looked at various other species, including tarpons, jacks, mackerels, snapper, marine mammals, sharks, and that harvest has an impact on all of them. And there's been a little bit more focus on redfish because, again, it's so culturally important and it is a game fish. But even the data on redfish has such huge gaps in it in terms of Menhaden impacts. That it's hard to even use it reliably. When you have these huge gaps in the data, the industry can pick the low end, we'll pick the high end, but nobody really even knows who's right. But I can tell you that, after what we see in the wake of these boats, an estimate that it's only a handful of redfish getting killed every year is wrong. I mean, we're talking potentially 100,000+ brood stock fish that are getting killed in these nets, and maybe even more than that. But we don't have the data to prove it. So, Richard, what do you think are the shortcomings right now in, say, political, social efforts here? And what kind of ground do we need to make up there to get through to legislators, lawmakers in our state to move this forward?
Oh boy, let's see how much trouble I can get myself into. Well, I think we saw clearly at this year's legislative session that there are certain powers that be that made it very difficult to reach anyone with any facts about what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it and why we're trying to bring Menhaden in with all of the other fisheries from a what do we know about it perspective. We're saying, in the meantime, let's just get them off the beach. We're saying and we think we have a pretty good argument that it's not going to affect their industry, their livelihoods whatsoever. That's not the way they see it. They have consistently hit on the heartstring argument of, well, you guys are coming after our jobs. You're going to cause us to have to fire our low-wage employees. You're not going after us. You're going after lower middle-class families who can barely feed their family. Now, could they pay them more? Of course. Should they pay them more? Well, I'm not an economist and I'm not in their meetings, but well, why are they lower down the socioeconomic chain? But anyway, that's beside the point. So the biggest issue, I think, with our legislature in a defensible way that isn't, well, you know, I'm friends with these people, is jobs. So when, I'm not gonna say if, when we are able to make a change on this issue, we are gonna have to continue making the argument that this is not costing any jobs. There is a map, a heat map of Menhaden density harvest that was released by the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries during one of those many stakeholder meetings that Chris and I sat through. This map showed that the vast majority, and when I say the vast majority, I'm talking upwards of 99% of Menhaden harvest actually happens well outside of a half mile, well outside of a mile. Now it does happen within a half mile and a mile, a few hundred feet from the beach as we saw, but it doesn't have to. Those fish are way out there. So when we say let's push these guys off the beach a half mile or a mile, the data clearly shows that's not asking you to catch one fewer Menhaden. We're not asking them to catch one fewer Menhaden. Now maybe our opinion on that would change when we get these biological or ecological studies, but for now, we're not asking them to catch one fewer fish. And they'll say, well, it'll cost us more in fuel because now we can fish by the beach and we're gonna have to go further out. Well, it's not like these boats leave Empire and take an immediate right. Right? That they're going several miles out, their spotter plane is telling them where to go, and if they come back within a half mile of shore, they're coming back, they're burning more fuel. So there's tons of added expense and losing jobs arguments that are very, very, very easy to fight. And we're gonna keep fighting them and hopefully cracking through with some legislatures. And as you mentioned, Chris, I feel very confident about the number of legislatures we have in Louisiana on our side. The issue is you gotta get through certain committees and you gotta get through certain legislators who swing a big stick and can affect how other legislators vote. Once we either have different people in those positions or we're able to convince that very small number of legislators, I think we'll like where we are.
Jesse, what do you think the role of the industry is in this? Both on the political side, which is part of what we do. It's an unfortunate reality that's where this stuff happens, but also on driving the better science. What do you think the role of your company and other companies that are part of ASA and the broader fishing industry, how can they be more engaged in pushing this?
Well, I'll say by doing what I'm doing and trying to get up in front of people and share my personal experiences first, right? But as somebody who is a leader in this particular company, I bring it to my team and say, what can we do to drive a little bit more awareness, whether it's my social team, whether it's my product team, right? We live off of new products, the development of them, especially for this particular market. So I want to make sure that when we develop products, perhaps there's something that we can do, right? To engage our customers a little deeper and tell them why this is important. Because quite frankly, a lot of times they have no clue outside of this particular area that this is going on. There's a lot of visibility in the Gulf area, but you get up, hey listen, I live 1,500 miles north of the Gulf, right? You think anybody around me really knows what's going on? Now there's millions of anglers, well you do, Jeff, right? But there's millions of anglers, right? I sit around some of the shows that I go to during the winter months, because really unless you want to go ice fishing, there's not a lot of fishing to do. And we have introduced muskie fishermen and pike fishermen to big bull reds, and they lose their minds, right? It's our job to be able to do that and educate outside of just this particular area. I utilize the ASA data. The website's great. I can drill down into the economics of Louisiana right through the ASA website. I utilize that data in my area to show how important the fisheries are from an economic standpoint. Collectively, we need to use that information to illustrate, we are more important as an industry, as an economic center, than any of these pokey boats and processors. That's where it becomes important. Now, I'm sitting here kind of thinking about what can we do as an industry? Well, collectively, we need to sit together and talk about how important this is from an economic standpoint. You know, if I look at it and I say, I'm selling 25,000 rods in Louisiana, what does that mean to me? Now you expand that into baits, line, lures, everything else. That is important to us collectively. What can we do then to join forces to bring visibility to it? And maybe some programs that can, my CEO isn't here, right? Okay. You know, develop programs that can actually drive funds to support movements. Because this is what's important. If we can't, you know, I sat here and listened to the Atlantic issue, and I'm gonna guess that it's fairly successful. They realize that what they've done there is successful. Where aren't we looking at that for the Gulf? And I want to do whatever we can to support driving any legislation that can support this fishery. So my job, quite frankly, is to take my peers and bring that visibility. That's what like I said, I get a little passionate about this particular item, but that's what I'm willing to do. That's what I want to do.
Bring them down. Fish is still good, and I know that the folks in Richard's organization appreciate the money, so.
I'll be down there twice in October, just so you know.
I'll be there too. So I'd like to open it up for questions. I know we ran a little bit long, but if anybody's got any questions, in the back, yes sir.
Yeah, I'm a outdoor rider, just made my whole career in the Texas-Louisiana border, so we see the boats, we deal with it all the time, and people will get fired up when a few dead tarpon and a bunch of bull redfish wash up. But in terms of the ecological impact of harvesting the Menhaden itself, from a communication standpoint to the angler out there, how do we bridge the gap between saying it's not only the bykill, it's also the impact on the Menhaden itself? And sometimes with habitat issues, you get crickets, but if I mention taking a few trout away from the background, it's like an onslaught. So the panel here, how can we help communicate better the ecological part of this? Is there a pathway to that?
I'll take that one first. I think there is. I think it would help if we had some science to point to, you know, and I'm a little disappointed, and I think there's probably some people in the room who could answer this question for me, but I think we were expecting to see a final product on that study out of the University of Florida earlier this year, and we haven't seen it. And I'm not quite sure why we haven't. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I'm not going to go down that path, but I'm not sure why we haven't seen it. And I think that would help put us a little definition on it. I think in referencing that study, and it was something that was presented to the Gulf Commission, in referencing that study, we've been told that saying to people that Menhaden harvest to the Menhaden industry is causing a 50% reduction in biomass of speckled trout and redfish. We've been told it's wrong to say that, even though that's what the PowerPoint presentation said. But it also has been said that it is significant. It's not a minuscule amount of fish that are being reduced because of this industry. It is a significant amount. And personally, I think 100,000 redfish that look like that dying every year is significant. There are some biologists in our state who don't think that that's significant, and I take exception to that. So I think from a conservation standpoint and from someone who loves the fishery, appeal to their passion. Say, guys, how many dead redfish that look like that is enough? How many fish dying in these nets is a tolerable number? Where should we set that expectation? In my mind, it's a lot less than what they're killing now. If anybody else cares, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, not to just tout the Atlantic as a perfect model, but putting our story is there. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission just released a storyboard that walks through the process that we went through. And as Aaron mentioned, it's limited, but the ecosystem is so vast that we had to get to a point where we were incorporating sort of the biggest predators in the model, and the importance of striped bass really rose to the top because they're a top predator of Menhaden. And so just using that Atlantic model as a storyboard for getting progress in the Gulf, I think might be a useful, a useful storyboard to kind of go through, because you can point them to something that, hey, look, another commission went through this process, and although it has some limitations, it's much superior to single species management.
Yeah.
And a lot of science went into it, a lot of people worked on it, and like I said, it was just this huge effort that culminated into a harvest limit for Menhaden that incorporates the importance of Menhaden to predators like striped bass.
Awesome.
And the striped bass fishery for the Atlantic is the fishery in that region.
Perfect.
I'll be very brief, and I'll add to it on how to reach people on necessarily not, you're fired up if you see dead redfish, but if you see a bunch of dead pogies, maybe you don't really care about that as much in terms of enticing people to care about that. We all learned how important the food chain was back in school. I'm sure there are many biologists in this room who continue to learn it long after I learned it when I was in public schools. But think of it as like Destin, Florida at midnight, because you have to consider that, yes, there are, 100 billion pounds of pogies in the Gulf of Mexico, but this 1 billion that's caught every year is only caught off the coast of Louisiana, so that creates some potentially, depending on these studies, pending localized depletion. So for species like redfish that would prefer to eat pogies, instead they're gonna go eat something else. It could be like Destin at midnight. Whole Foods is closed, Jimmy John's is closed. So I gotta choose between Burger King and Whataburger. So you're not getting the best nutrition. That could be having adverse effects on the other species up the food chain, which are the ones that our constituents care about.
Brett and then Whit.
Chris, first I just want to credit you for not letting go of this. It's been a few years that we've been talking about it, and I know the fact that you've bit in and never let go has started to show some results.
Thank you.
Clearly there's two things here that are the focus point: the user conflict that's localized, and then the bigger issue of trying to wrap your heads around management of the species itself and an ecosystem type. How do you, as TRCP, how do you, I don't want to jinx anything, but I think that the user conflict thing is something that is going to happen more, it's going to come to head a lot sooner and be resolved. How do you keep the local community there engaged once that is done and it doesn't, because this is not going to be something like Capone and tax evasion that it puts them out. That's one issue that's part of the bigger problem. But it's also the one that is the most obvious in people. And like I said, I see the writing on the wall. I think you're going to get where you want to be with that. How do we keep the community there engaged to make sure that the ball keeps moving in the right direction to get the big steps done?
Yeah, it's a great question. We in any conservation effort, there is a period of fatigue, I think, among the people you asked to be engaged in this. But I think the primary thing is for us to drive home to them that if we get a bill or we get a policy directive or something like that moves these boats off the beach and takes care of that concern, that doesn't eliminate the concern. It doesn't eliminate the fact that no matter where this harvest is no matter where it takes place, the removal of that amount of biomass from a relatively small area is having an impact on your ability to fish. Frankly, there's just no other way to look at this from our perspective, at least from my perspective. I don't want to speak from as TRCP. I want to say somebody who's fished Louisiana and has had to become intimately familiar, unfortunately, with how this fishery is perpetrated. It's a filthy fishery. It's filthy. Just to watch how those guys do their business, it's hard to stomach, And I think we're in the process of developing the kind of products and information that's going to make that clear to the public. You know, there's not been a ton of light shown on how this fishery is conducted in the Gulf. I think once people see that, they'll know that simply moving them off the beach is not the ultimate solution. Whit?
Going back to that point, I mean, doesn't the fact that they're targeting the baby pogie potentially illustrate a much bigger problem, which is they can't find the big ones anymore?
Aaron?
Because obviously it's going to be much more efficient to target the big fish.
Well, I mean, it's relative. It's not like the difference between a 5-pound yellowfin tuna and a 150-pound yellowfin tuna. I think part of it is allocation of resources. When the plane's up, they're looking for the biggest ball of fish they can find closest to their boats. And so if their boat happens to be 10 miles out and you happen to see a school of pogie 8 miles out, they go for that one. So I think that's part of it, is just allocation. They're trying to minimize costs and maximize benefits. But generally, yeah, when you start fishing the smaller fish, that tells you that the larger fish, the schools of larger fish aren't as large, and so it's not as efficient for them to go and set the net, make a set around that school of fish. They can get a larger school inshore. So yeah, it's a classic indicator of you're going the downward slope on the wrong side of the slope.
And I'll add to that briefly. I also think that they like trapping them against the bottom, that makes it a more efficient fishery for them, and that's easier to do in 4 to 6 feet of water than it is in 14 to 16 feet of water.
Yeah, they'll tell you that it's easier for the plane to see them in shallow water, and in very particular spots. In fact, we were pretty close to getting the Menhaden industry, the 2 pogie processors, to agree to a half-mile buffer. But they were insistent that that area between the Empire and Grand Isle, they had to have access right up to the beach. And we were like, look, we're not interested in saying we care about this part of Louisiana, but we don't care about this part. And frankly, there's too many people in that part of the state that care about this. There was no way that my friends in Empire, Louisiana, or Buras were going to let me get away with reaching an agreement, let any of us get away with reaching an agreement that left their part of the state out. And so, better to fight the long-term fight and get a better result than take a short-term answer that really doesn't solve anything. Skorsky.
So, are these guys active 365 days a year aside from weather, breakdowns and such?
No, there's a season. It's generally April 15th to around October 15th, and it's when weather's generally most cooperative, but the fish are also closer to shore and other size that they can harvest. And as we talked about earlier, the problem with that is, the bulk of that season directly coincides when the bull redfish are out on these passes and are on the beaches spawning. And so that's where your conflicts are happening.
And I've been heavily involved in the Atlantic Menhaden conversations, what brought me to CCA Maryland, and I'm currently the executive director after volunteering for more than a decade. And we've talked about the Atlantic winds, but I want everybody to recognize that we're still running the marathon. I don't know what mile we're in, but we're still running. It's not over. We have the same user conflicts in the Chesapeake Bay. So while we have major advancements in science and management, the role for anglers and grassroots effort is still as alive as ever. There is fatigue. There's a lot of complexity to it, but all of us need to realize that we're not scientists, we're not politicians, unless we are. But we can engage in the political arena powerfully as individuals, but more powerfully in groups. And from a science perspective, this isn't that complicated. I'm a visual guy. I like cartoons. It makes sense. They're easy. We have one on our website of gravestones of river herring, of weak fish, and there's striped bass sitting at a dinner table with blue crabs on the table. That's all they have left to eat. And then the watermen that harvest the blue crabs are saying we can't have a lot of striped bass because they'll eat all our crabs. And it's like, we've collapsed the system so much. And visually, it's easy to tell the story. So focus on that stuff if you're telling those stories. Show the pictures. You can Google Menhaden cartoon. One of the first ones will pop up to me as one of the best that's ever been made. It's probably from the 90s. And it's a typical political cartoon. It's the triangle. It's the trophic levels of the system, the small fish that transfer algae into food, which is what the Menhaden does. To then feed fish, birds, whales, etc. It just shows a boat there with a vacuum cleaner sucking up the base of that pyramid. And if people can't logically understand the problem there, then I don't know what we can do. But visually, I think is a great way to tell the story. And I would encourage everybody in the angling community to do that as much as you can, because one video can be perceived as one activity, but it's happening April 15th, October 31st every single year. Why not a video a day? We have power as a community that we need to exercise on this and hop into this run, into this marathon. Put the shoes on, let's get running.
Well, there are a lot of videos out there. I didn't want to spend an hour and a half or, a week and a half showing them all, but especially in the last couple of years, we have been inundated. And we're getting more, because I think it's really shining a light on what's happening in the water. Any other questions? Folks, I want to tell you how much I appreciate y'all being here. It's good to be back in person. I think we've had another successful event. I want to thank our staff again, Corey Deal, Jenny Henry, Tara Schultz, Witt, our support staff back at home, all of our partners, our sponsors, Bass Pro, Costa, Peak Design, Pure Fishing, Yamaha, FWC, RBFF, and ASA again. And we'll hopefully be back here next year with two even more lively topics than we had in the last couple of days. But if you notice on our handouts, there's contact information for our panelists if you want to do some follow-ups. And of course, you're always welcome to contact us at TRCP, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Enjoy the rest of the show, and thanks again for being here.